Hello, everyone. It is time to read The Shining. Today we will be starting with chapter 24, which is named Snow. I'm starting a little bit late from my perspective, of course, so we're going to mostly jump right into it. The last thing that happened was Jack had his encounter with the hedge animals, where he thought that he saw them move for an extended period of time, not just like little movements, like completely changing the perspective and stuff as if they existed in 3D space. Pretty crazy, but he covered up his eyes and waited for them to pounce on him like it looked like they were going to, and he found that there was nothing. He seemed to have been hallucinating it. I'm getting a bunch of ads. Stop adding me. They're just doing a bit in the RM Brown server where they just add people over and over. So I'm just gonna have to I'm just gonna close Discord. Hold on, I'm gonna close it from my task manager because that is annoying. So that was a weird event. It was the first time, really, we've seen something explicitly like either paranormal or hallucinatory happen to Jack Torrance. You know, we've seen that happen to Doc on more than one occasion, but we also know that Doc is psychic and he's attuned to things that he's attuned to sort of the residual energies of the hotel in a way that doesn't make it super exceptional for him to have strange experiences there. But that's as far as that's really the first like truly strange experience Jack has had. So that's interesting. I feel like that represents an escalation that is pretty crazy, which is good because we're on 24 of I think 58 now, so we're not quite at the halfway. I have hot chocolate here, but it's so fucking hot. Ugh, I made it like 20 minutes ago and it's still too hot to drink. Oh, it's so good though. With final season, I have not really had a chance to finish or to get back to reading ahead, so we're going to be reading some more chapters that I haven't read in a while, so I'm going to go through them a little more slowly. I'm going to be looking ahead and stuff, checking for typos and the ways I want to intonate different sentences and stuff. You know the drill. Let's begin. Chapter 24. Snow. It was dusk. They stood on the porch in the fading light, Jack in the middle, his left arm around Danny's shoulders and his right arm around Wendy's waist. Together they watched as the decision was taken out of their hands. The sky had completely clouded over by 2:30 and it had begun to snow an hour later. And this time, you didn't need a weatherman to tell you it was serious snow. No flurry that was going to melt or blow away when the evening wind started to whoop. At first it had fallen in perfectly straight lines, building up a snow cover that coated everything evenly. But now, an hour after it had started, the wind had begun to blow from the northwest and the snow had begun to drift against the porch and the sides of the Overlook's driveway. Beyond the grounds, the highway had disappeared under an even blanket of white. The hedge animals were also gone, but when Wendy and Danny had gotten home, she had commended him on the job he had done. "Do you think so?" he had asked, and said no more. Now the hedges were buried under amorphous white cloaks. Curiously, all of them were thinking different thoughts, but feeling the same emotion. Relief. The bridge had been crossed. "Will it ever be spring?" Wendy murmured. Jack squeezed her tighter. "Before you know it. What do you say we go in and have some supper? It's cold out here." She smiled. All afternoon Jack had seemed distant and, well, odd. Now he sounded more like his normal self. "Fine by me. How about you, Danny?" "Sure." So they went in together, leaving the wind to build to the low-pitched scream that would go on all night, a sound they would get to know well. Flakes of snow swirled and danced across the porch. The Overlook faced it as it had for nearly 3/4 of a century, its darkened windows now bearded with snow, indifferent to the fact that it was now cut off from the world. Or possibly it was pleased with the prospect. Inside its shell, the three of them went about their early evening routine, like microbes trapped in the intestine of a monster. And that's chapter 24. Chapter 24 is one page, and it's called Snow. And I can see why he did that. You know, like the bridge has been crossed. That was our point of no return chapter. I can see the appeal in letting it have me this own chapter. It's this little quiet moment where they all just accept that now they're going to be at the Overlook until the spring. I'm a fan of that. Let's see if this thing is cooled down at all. Oh, it's a little bit. It's good. It's not the shitty stuff from the coffee machine. It's a packet. Made with milk instead of water. Okay. Alright, well, I don't want to hype this next chapter up, but it hypes itself up. Chapter 25 is titled Inside 217. Yeah, okay, here we go. A week and a half later, 2 feet of snow lay white and crisp and even on the grounds of the Overlook Hotel. The hedge menagerie was buried up to its haunches. The rabbit, frozen on its hind legs, seemed to be rising from a white pool. Some of the drifts were over 5 feet deep. The wind was constantly changing them, sculpting them into sinuous, dune-like shapes. Twice Jack had snowshoed clumsily around in the equipment shed for a shovel to clear the porch. The third time he shrugged, simply cleared a path through the towering drift lying against the door, and let Danny amuse himself by sledding to the right and left of the path. The truly heroic drifts lay against the Overlook's west side. Some of them towered to a height of 20 feet, and behind them the ground was scoured bare to the grass by the constant wind flow. The first floor windows were covered, and the view from the dining room, which Jack had so admired on closing day, was now no more than a view of blank movie screen. Their phone had been out for the last 8 days, and the CB radio in Ullman's office was now their only communication link with the outside world. It snowed every day now, sometimes only brief flurries that powdered the glittering snow crust, sometimes for real. The low whistle of the wind cranking up to a womanish shriek that made the old hotel rock and groan alarmingly, even in its deep cradle of snow. Night temperatures had not gotten above 10 degrees, and although the thermometer by the kitchen service entrance sometimes got as high as 25 in the early afternoons, the steady knife edge of the wind made it uncomfortable to go out without a ski mask. But they all did go out on the days when the sun shone, usually wearing 2 sets of clothing and mittens on over their gloves. Getting out was almost a compulsive thing. The hotel was circled with the double track of Danny's flexible flyer. The permutations were nearly endless. Danny riding while his parents pulled, Daddy riding and laughing while Wendy and Danny tried to pull. It was possible for them to pull on the icy crust, and flatly impossible when powder covered it. Danny and Mommy riding, Wendy riding by herself while her menfolk pulled and puffed white vapor like dray horses, pretending she was heavier than she was. Damn. They laughed a great deal on these sled excursions around the house, but the whooping and impersonal voice of the wind, so huge and hollowly sincere, made their laughter seem tinny and forced. They had seen caribou tracks in the snow, and once the caribou themselves, a group of 5 standing motionlessly below the security fence. They had all taken turns with Jack's Zysikon binoculars to see them better, and looking at them had given Wendy a weird, unreal feeling. They were standing leg deep in the snow that covered the highway, and it came to her that between now and the spring thaw, the road belonged more to the caribou than it did to them. Now the things that men had made up here were neutralized. The caribou understood that, she believed. She had put the binoculars down and had said something about starting lunch, and in the kitchen she had cried a little, trying to rid herself of the awful pent-up feeling that sometimes fell on her like a large, pressing hand over her heart. She thought of the caribou. She thought of the wasps Jack had put out of the service entrance platform under the Pyrex bowl to freeze. There were plenty of snowshoes hung from nails in the equipment shed, and Jack found a pair to fit each of them, although Danny's pair was quite a bit outsized. Jack did well with them, although he had not snowshoed since his boyhood in Berlin, New Hampshire. He retaught himself quickly. Wendy didn't care much for it. Even 15 minutes of tramping around on the outsized laced paddles made her legs and ankles ache outrageously. But Danny was intrigued, and working hard to pick up the knack. He still fell often, but Jack was pleased with his progress. He said that by February, Danny would be skipping circles around both of them. This day was overcast, and by noon the sky had already begun to spit snow. The radio was promising another 8 to 12 inches, and chanting hosannas to precipitation, the great god of Colorado skiers. Wendy, sitting in the bedroom and knitting a scarf, thought to herself that she knew exactly what the skiers could do with all that snow. She knew exactly where they could put it. Jack was in the cellar. He had gone down to check the furnace and boiler. Such checks had become a ritual with him since the snow had closed them in. After satisfying himself that everything was going well, he had wandered through the arch, screwed the light bulb on, and had seated himself in an old and cobwebby camp chair he had found. He was leafing through the old records and papers, constantly wiping his mouth with his handkerchief as he did so. Confinement had bleached his skin of its autumn tan. And as he sat hunched over the yellowed, crackling sheets, his reddish blonde hair tumbling untidily over his forehead, he looked slightly lunatic. He had found some odd things tucked in among the invoices, bits of lighting, receipts, disquieting things, a bloody strip of sheeting, a dismembered teddy bear that seemed to have been slashed to pieces, a crumpled sheet of Violet Lady's stationery, a ghost of perfume still clinging to it beneath the musk of age, a note begun and left unfinished in faded blue ink. Dearest Tommy, I can't think so well up here as I had hoped. About us, I mean. Of course, who else? Ha ha. Things keep getting in the way. I've had strange dreams about things going bump in the night. Can you believe that? But that was all. The note was dated June 27th, 1934. He found a hand puppet that seemed to be either a witch or a warlock. Something with long teeth and a pointy hat at any rate. It had been improbably tucked between a bundle of natural gas receipts and a bundle of receipts for Vichy water. And something that happened to be a poem, scribbled on the back of a menu in dark pencil. Madoc, are you here? I've been sleepwalking again, my dear. The plants are moving under the rug. No date on the menu and no name on the poem, if it was a poem. Elusive, but fascinating. It seemed to him that these things were like pieces in a jigsaw, things that would eventually fit together if he could find the right linking pieces, and so he kept looking, jumping and wiping his lips every time the furnace roared to life behind him. Danny was standing outside room 217 again. It's starting to cool off finally. The passkey was in his pocket. He was staring at the door with a kind of drugged avidity, and his upper body seemed to twitch and jiggle beneath his flannel shirt. He was humming softly and tunelessly. He hadn't wanted to come here, not after the fire hose. He was too scared to come here. He was scared that he had taken the passkey again, disobeying his father. He wanted to come here. He had wanted to come here. Curiosity killed the cat. Satisfaction brought him back. It was like a constant fishhook in his brain, a kind of nagging siren song that would not be appeased. And hadn't Mr. Halloran said, I don't think there's anything here that can hurt you. You promised. Promises are made to be broken. He jumped at that. It was as if that thought had come from outside, insectile, buzzing, softly cahooling. Promises were made to be broken, my dear. Red rum, to be broken, splintered, shattered, hammered apart. Bore! His nervous humming broke into a low, atonal song. Loo, skip to my loo, my darling. Hadn't Mr. Halloran been right? Hadn't that been, in the end, the reason why he had kept silent and allowed the snow to close them in? Just close your eyes and it'll be gone. What he had seen in the presidential suite had gone away, and the snake had only been a fire hose that had fallen onto the rug. Yes, even the blood in the presidential suite had been harmless. Something old, something that happened long before he was born, or even thought of. Something that was done with. Like a movie that only he could see. There was nothing, really nothing in this hotel that could hurt him. And if he had to prove that to himself by going into this room, shouldn't he do so? Loo, skip to my loo. Curiosity killed the cat, my dear. Red rum, my dear. Satisfaction brought him back safe and sound. From toast to crown, from head to the ground, he was safe and sound. He knew that those things are like scary pictures. They can't hurt you, but oh my God, what big teeth you have, Grandma. And is that a wolf in a bluebeard suit or a bluebeard in a wolf suit? And I'm so glad you asked, because curiosity killed the hat, and it was the hope of satisfaction that brought him up in the hall, treading softly over the blue and twisting jungle carpet. He had stopped by the fire extinguisher. He had put the brass nozzle back in the frame, and then he had poked it repeatedly with his finger, heart-thumping, whispering, Come on and hurt me. Come on and hurt me, you cheap prick. Can't do it, can you? Huh, you're nothing but a cheap fire hose. Can't do nothing but lie there. Come on, come on! He had felt insane with bravado. And nothing had happened. It was only a hose after all. Only canvas and brass. You could hack it to pieces and it would never complain. Never twist and jerk and bleed green slime all over the blue carpet, because it was only a hose. Not a nose and not a rose, not glass buttons or satin bows, but a snake in a sleepy doze. And he had hurried on. He had hurried on because he was late. Late! I'm late, said the White Rabbit. The White Rabbit. Yes. Now there was a white rabbit out by the playground. Once it had been green, but now it was white, as if something had shocked it repeatedly on the snowy, windy nights and turned it old. Danny took the passkey from his pocket and slid it into the lock. Lulu. The White Rabbit had been on its way to a croquet party, to the Red Queen's croquet party. Storks for mallets, hedgehogs for halls. He touched the key. He let his fingers wander over it. His head felt dry and sick. He turned the key, and the tumblers thumped back smoothly. Off with his head! Off with his head! Off with his head! This game isn't croquet, though. The mallets are too short. This game is whack! Boom! Straight through the wicket! Off with his head! Danny pushed the door open. It swung smoothly, without a creak. He was standing just outside a large combination bed-sitting room. And although the snow had not reached up this far, the highest drifts were still a foot below the second-floor windows. The room was dark because Daddy had closed all the shutters on the western exposure 2 weeks ago. He stood in the doorway, fumbled to his right, and found the switch plate. 2 bulbs and an overhead cut-glass fixture came on. Danny stepped further in and looked around. The rug was deep and soft, a quiet rose color, soothing. A double bed with a white coverlet. A writing desk. Pray tell me, why is a raven like a writing desk? By the large shuttered window. During the season, the constant writer, having a wonderful time, wish you were here, would have a pretty view of the mountains to describe to the folks back home. I have a little bit I have to wipe off here. They get another drink. He stepped further in. Nothing here. Nothing at all. Only an empty room. Cold because Daddy was heating the east wing today. A bureau. A closet, its door open to reveal a clutch of hotel hangers, the kind you can't steal. Why do I have... Surely that's not a problem with my reader. No, it's not. A Gideon Bible on an end table. To his left was the bathroom door, a full-length mirror on it reflecting his own white-faced image. The door was ajar and... He watched his double nod slowly. Yes, that's where it was, whatever it was. In there. In the bathroom. His double in the mirror walked forward, as if to escape the glass. It put its hand out, pressed it against his own. Then it fell away at an angle as the bathroom door swung open. He looked in. A long room, old-fashioned like a Pullman car. Tiny white hexagonal tiles on the floor. At the far end, a toilet with the lid up. At the right, a wash basin and another mirror above it, the kind that hides a medicine cabinet. To the left, a huge white tub on claw feet. The shower curtain pulled closed. Danny stepped into the bathroom and walked toward the tub, dreamily, as if propelled from outside himself, as if this whole thing were one of the dreams Tony had brought him, that he would perhaps see something nice when he pulled the shower curtain back, something Daddy had forgotten, or something Mommy had lost, something that would make them both happy. So he pulled the shower curtain back. The woman in the tub had been dead for a long time. She was bloated and purple. Her gas-filled belly rose out of the cold, ice-rimmed water like some fleshy island. Her eyes were fixed on Danny's, glassy and huge like marbles. She was grinning. Her purple lips were pulled back in a grimace. Her breasts lolled. Her pubic hair floated. Her hands were frozen on the gnarled porcelain sides of the tub like crab claws. Danny shrieked, but the sound never escaped his lips. Turning inward and inward, it fell down in his darkness like a stone in a well. He took a single blundering step backward, burying his heels... What's another typo? Hearing his heels clack on the white hexagonal tiles, and at the same moment his urine broke, spilling effortlessly out of him. The woman was sitting up. Still grinning, her huge marble eyes fixed on him, she was sitting up. Her dead palms made squittering noises on the porcelain. Her breasts swayed like ancient cracked punching bags. There was the minute sound of breaking ice shards. She was not breathing. She was a corpse, and dead long years. Danny turned and ran, bolting through the bathroom door, his eyes starting from their sockets, his hair on end like the hair of a hedgehog about to be turned into a sacrificial croquet or roque ball. His mouth open and soundless, he ran full tilt into the outside door of 217, which was now closed. He began hammering on it, far beyond realizing that it was unlocked, and he had only to turn the knob to let himself out. His mouth pealed forth deafening screams that were beyond human auditory range. He could only hammer on the door and hear the dead woman coming for him. Bloated belly, dry hair, outstretched hands, something that had lain slain in that tub for perhaps years, embalmed there in magic. The door would not open, would not. And then the voice of Dick Halloran came to him, so sudden and unexpected, so calm that his locked vocal cords opened, and he began to cry weakly, not with fear, but with blessed relief. I don't think they can hurt you. They're like pictures in a book. Close your eyes and they'll be gone. His eyelids snapped down. His hands curled into balls. His shoulders hunched with the effort of his concentration. Nothing is there, nothing is there. No, not at all. Nothing is there. There's nothing. Time passed, and he was just beginning to relax. Just beginning to realize that the door must be unlocked and he could go. When the year's damp, bloated, fish-smelling hands closed softly around his throat, and he was turned implacably around to stare into that dead and purple face. The end of chapter 25. Damn. That is one hell of a chapter. Holy shit. Discordo. I couldn't keep it closed. I'm sorry, I have a problem. I have an addiction. I didn't even miss anything. Well, now this book's starting to pick up, huh? Tonight is the night that it really gets good. So, I think if you're somebody who stayed around this long, you are being rewarded, I would say. Woo-hoo. Here we go. Part 4 of The Shining. Snowbound. Let's jump right into it. Chapter 26. Dreamland. Who the fuck is slamming doors out there? That's what I need right now. Knitting made her sleepy. Today, even Bartok would have made her sleepy. And it wasn't Bartok in the little phonograph, it was Bach. Her hands grew slower and slower, and at the time her son was making an acquaintance of room 217's long-term resident, Wendy was asleep with her knitting in her lap. The yarn and needles rose in the slow time of her breathing. Her sleep was deep, and she did not dream. Jack Torrance had fallen asleep too, but his sleep was light and uneasy, populated by dreams that seemed too vivid to be mere dreams. They were certainly more vivid than any dreams he had ever had before. His eyes had begun to get heavy as he leafed through packets of milk bills, 100 to a packet, seemingly tens of thousands altogether. Yet he gave each one a cursory glance, afraid that by not being thorough, he might miss exactly the piece of Overlookania he needed to make the mystic connection that he was sure must be here somewhere. He felt like a man with a power cord in one hand, groping around in a dark and unfamiliar room for a socket. If he could find it, he would be rewarded with a view of wonders. He had come to grips with Al Shockley's phone call and his request. His strange experience in the playground had helped him do that. That had been too damn close to some kind of breakdown. He was convinced that it was his mind in revolt against Al's high, goddamn-handed request that he chuck his book project. It had been maybe a signal that his own sense of self-respect could only be pushed so far before disintegrating entirely. He would write the book. If it meant the end of his association with Al Shockley, that would have to be. He would write the hotel's biography, write it straight from the shoulder, and the introduction would be his hallucination that the topiary animals had moved. The title would be uninspired but workable. Strange Resort, the story of the Overlook Hotel. Straight from the shoulder, yes, but it would not be written vindictively, in any effort to get back at Al, or Stuart Ullman, or George Hatfield, or his father, as miserable bullying drunk that he had been, or anyone else for that matter. He would write it because the Overlook had enchanted him. Could any other explanation be so simple or so true? He would write it for the reason he felt that all great literature, fiction and nonfiction, was written. Truth comes out. In the end, it always comes out. He would write it because he felt that he had to. 500 gallons of whole milk, 100 gallons of skim milk, PD, billed to account, 300 pints orange juice, PD. He slipped down further in his chair, still holding a clutch of the receipts, but his eyes no longer looking at what was printed there. They had come unfocused. A little bit of heartburn here, sorry, give me a sec. His lids were slow and heavy. His mind had slipped from the overlook to his father, who had been a male nurse at the Berlin Community Hospital. Big man. A fat man who had towered 6 feet 2 inches. Had been taller than Jack even when Jack got to his full growth of 6 feet even. Not that the old man had still been around then. Run to the litter, he would say, and then cuff Jack lovingly and laugh. There had been 2 older brothers, both taller than their father, and Becky, who at 5'10", had only been 2 inches shorter than Jack, and taller than he for most of their childhood. His relationship with his father had been like the unfurling of some flower of beautiful potential, which, when wholly opened, turned out to be blighted inside. Until he had been 7, he had loved the tall, big-bellied man uncritically and strongly in spite of the spankings, the black and blues, the occasional black eye. He could remember velvet summer nights, the house quiet, oldest brother Brett out with his girl, middle brother Mike studying something, Becky and their mother in the living room watching something on the bulky old TV. He would sit in the hall dressed in a pajama singlet and nothing else, ostensibly playing with his trucks, actually waiting for the moment when the silence would be broken by the door swinging open with a large bang, the bellow of his father's welcome when he saw Jackie was waiting, his own happy squeal in answer as the big man came down the hall, his pink scalp growing beneath his crew cut in the glow of the hall light. Glowing, I guess, not growing. I'm not sure if that was a typo or if I misread it. In the light, he always looked like some soft and flapping oversized ghost in his hospital whites. The shirt always untucked and sometimes bloody, the pants cuffs drooping down over the black shoes. His father would sweep him into his arms, and Jackie would be propelled deliriously upward, so fast that it seemed he could feel air pressure settling against his skull like a cap made out of lead. Up and up, both of them crying, "Elevator! Elevator!" And there had been nights when his father in his drunkenness had not stopped the upward lift of his slab-muscled arms soon enough, and Jackie had gone right over his father's flat-topped head like a human projectile to crash land on the hall floor behind his dad. But on other nights his father would only sweep him into a giggling ecstasy, through the zone of air where beer hung around his father's face like a mist of raindrops, to be twisted and turned and shaken like a laughing rag, and finally to be set down on his feet, hiccuping with reaction. The receipt slipped from his relaxing hand and seesawed down the air to land lazily on the floor. His eyelids, which had settled shut with his father's image tattooed on their backs like stereopticon images, opened a little bit and then slipped back down again. He twitched a little. Consciousness, like the receipts, like autumn aspen leaves, seesawed lazily downward. Taking a drink. That had been the first phase of his relationship with his father. And as it was drawing to its end, he had become aware that Becky and his brothers, all of them older, hated their father, and that their mother, a nondescript woman who rarely spoke above a mutter, only suffered him because her Catholic upbringing said that she must. In those days it did not seem strange to Jack that the father won all his arguments with his children by the use of his fists, and it did not seem strange that his own love should go hand in hand with his fear. Fear of the elevator game, which might end in a splintering crash on any given night. Fear that his father's bearish good humor on his day off might suddenly change to boorish bellowing and the smack of his good right hand. And sometimes, he remembered, he had even been afraid that his father's shadow might fall over him while he was at play. It was near the end of this phase that he began to notice that Brett never brought his dates home, or Mike and Becky, their chums. Love began to curdle at 9, when his father put his mother into the hospital with his cane. He had begun to carry the cane a year earlier, when a car accident had left him lame. After that he was never without it, long and black and thick and gold-headed. Now dozing, Jack's body twitched in a remembered cringe at the sound it made in the air, a murderous swish, its heavy crack against the wall or against flesh. He had beaten their mother for no good reason at all. Suddenly, and without warning, they had been at the supper table. McCain had been standing by his chair. It was a Sunday night, the end of a 3-day weekend for Daddy, a weekend which he had boozed away in his usual inimitable style. Roast chicken, peas, mashed potatoes, Daddy at the head of the table, his plate heaped high, snoozing or nearly snoozing, his mother passing plates, and suddenly Daddy had been wide awake, his eyes set deeply into their fat eye sockets, glittering with a kind of stupid, evil petulance. They flickered from one member of the family to the next, and the vein in the center of his forehead was standing out prominently. Always a bad sign. One of his large freckled hands had dropped to the gold knob of the cane, caressing it. He had sensed something about coffee. To this day, Jack was sure it had been coffee that his father had said. Mama had opened her mouth to answer, and then the cane was whickering through the air, smashing against her face. Blood spurted from her nose. Becky screamed. Mama's spectacles dropped into her gravy. The cane had been drawn back, had come down again, this time on top of her head, splitting the scalp. Mama had dropped to the floor. He had been out of his chair and around to where she lay dazed on the carpet, brandishing the cane, moving with a fat man's grotesque speed and agility. Little eyes flashing, jowls quivering as he spoke to her, just as he had always spoken to his children during such outbursts. Now, by Christ, I guess you'll take your medicine now. Goddamn puppy. Whelp, come on and take your medicine. The cane had gone up and down on her 7 more times before Brett and Mike got hold of him, dragged him away, wrestled the cane out of his hand. Jack, little Jackie now, he was little Jackie now, dozing and mumbling in a cobwebby camp chair while the furnace roared into hollow life behind him. Knew exactly how many blows it had been because each soft whump against her mother's body had been engraved on his memory like the irrational swipe of chisel on stone. 7 whumps. No more, no less. He and Becky crying, unbelieving, looking at their mother's spectacles lying in the mashed potatoes, one cracked lens smeared with gravy. Brett shouting at Daddy from the back hall, telling him he'd kill him if he moved. Daddy saying over and over, "Damn little puppy, damn little whelp, give me my cane, you damn little pup, give it to me." Brett, brandishing it hysterically, saying, yeah, I'll give it to you. Just you move a little bit and I'll give you all you want and 2 extra. I'll give you plenty. Mama getting slowly to her feet, dazed, her face already puffed and swelling like an old tire with too much air in it, bleeding in 4 or 5 different places. She had said a terrible thing, perhaps the only thing Mama had ever said which Jackie could recall word for word. "Who's got the newspaper? Your daddy wants the funnies. Is it raining yet?" And then she sank to her knees again, her hair hanging in her puffed and bleeding face. Mike was calling the doctor, babbling into the phone. Could he come right away? It was their mother. No, he couldn't say what the trouble was, not over the phone, not over a party line, he just couldn't. Just come. The doctor came and took Mom away to the hospital where Daddy had worked all of his adult life. Daddy, sobered up some, or perhaps only with the stupid cunning of any hard-pressed animal, told the doctor she had fallen downstairs. There was blood on the tablecloth because he had tried to wipe her dear face with it. Had her glasses flown all the way through the living room and into the dining room to land in her mashed potatoes and gravy? The doctor asked with a kind of horrid, grinning sarcasm. Is that what happened, Mark? I've heard of folks who can get a radio station on their gold fillings, and I've seen a man get shot between the eyes and live to tell about it. But that is a new one on me. Daddy had merely shook his head and said he didn't know. They must have fallen off her face when he brought her through to the dining room. The 4 children had been stunned to silence by the calm stupendousness of the lie. 4 days later, Brett quit his job in the mill and joined the army. Jack had always felt it was not just the sudden and irrational beating his father had administered at the dining table, but the fact that, in the hospital, their mother had corroborated their father's story while holding the hand of the parish priest. Revolted, Brett had left them to whatever might come. He had been killed in Dong Ho Province in 1965, the year when Jack Torrance, undergraduate, had joined the active college agitation to end the war. He had waved his brother's bloody shirt at rallies that were increasingly well attended, but it was not Brett's face that hung before his eyes when he spoke. It was the face of his mother, a dazed, uncomprehending face, his mother saying, "Who's got the newspaper?" Mike escaped 3 years later when Jack was 12. He went to UNH on a hefty merit scholarship. A year after that, their father died of a sudden, massive stroke which occurred while he was prepping a patient for surgery. He had collapsed in his flapping and untucked hospital whites, dead possibly even before he hit the industrial black and red hospital tiles. Holy shit, my mouth is dry. Why is my mouth so dry? I guess you know the book is good. possibly dead before he hit the industrial black and red hospital tiles. 3 days later, the man who had dominated Jackie's life, the irrational white ghost god, was underground. The stone read, Mark Anthony Torrance, loving father. To that, Jack would have added one line. He knew how to play elevator. There had been a great lot of insurance money. There are people who collect insurance as compulsively as others collect coins and stamps, and Mark Torrance had been that type. The insurance money came in at the same time the monthly policy payments and liquor bills stopped. For 5 years they had been rich. Nearly rich. In his shallow, uneasy sleep, his face rose before him as if in a glass. His face, but not his face. The wide eyes and innocent bowed mouth of a boy sitting in the hall with his trucks, waiting for his daddy, waiting for the white ghost god, waiting for the elevator to rise up with dizzying, exhilarating speed through the salt and sawdust mist of exhaled taverns. Waiting, perhaps, for it to go crashing down, spilling old clock springs out of his ears while his daddy roared with laughter, and it transformed into Danny's face, so much like his own had been. His eyes had been light blue while Danny's were cloudy gray, but the lips were still made a bow, and his complexion was fair. Danny, in his study, wearing training pants, all his papers a soggy and fine, misty smell of beer rising, a dreadful batter in all ferment, rising on the wings of yeast, the breath of taverns, snap of bone, his own voice mewling drunkenly, Danny, are you okay, Doc? Oh God, your poor sweet arm. That face transformed into Mama's face, rising up from below the table, punched and bleeding, and Mama was saying, from your father, I repeat, an enormously important announcement from your father. Please stay tuned or tune immediately to the Happy Jack frequency. Repeat, tune immediately to the Happy Hour frequency. I repeat. A slow dissolve. Disembodied voices echoing up to him as if along an endless, cloudy hallway. Things keep getting in the way, dear Tommy. Medoc, are you here? I've been sleepwalking again, my dear. It's the inhuman monsters that I fear. Excuse me, Mr. Ullman, but isn't this the office with its file cabinets, Ullman's big desk, a blank reservations book for next year already in place? Never misses a trick, that Ullman. All the keys hanging neatly on their hooks, except for one. Which one? Which key? Passkey. Who's got the passkey? If we went upstairs, perhaps we'd see. And the big two-way radio on his shelf. He snapped it on. CB transmissions coming in short, crackly bursts. He switched the band and dialed across bursts of music, news, a preacher haranguing a softly moaning congregation, a weather report, and another voice which he dialed back to. It was his father's voice. Kill him. You have to kill him, Jackie, and her too, because a real artist must suffer, because each man kills the thing he loves, because they'll always be conspiring against you, trying to hold you back and drag you down. Right this minute, that boy of yours is where he shouldn't be. Trespassing, that's what he's doing. He's a goddamn little pup. Cane him for it, Jackie. Cane him within an inch of his life. Have a drink, Jackie, my boy, then we'll play the elevator game. Then I'll go with you while you give him his medicine. I know you can do it, of course you can. You must kill him. You have to kill him, Jackie, and her too, because a real artist must suffer, because each man... His father's voice, going up higher and higher, becoming something maddening, not human at all, something squealing and petulant and maddening, the voice of the ghost god, the pig god, coming dead at him out of the radio, and "No!" he screamed back. "You're dead! You're in your grave! You're not in me at all!" Because he had cut the father out of him, and it was not right that he should come back creeping through this hotel 2,000 miles from the New England town where his father had lived and died. He raised the radio up and brought it down, and smashed it on the floor, spilling old clock springs and tubes like the result of some crazy elevator game gone awry, making his father's voice gone, leaving only his voice, Jack's voice, Jackie's voice, chanting in the cold reality of the office, "Dead, you're dead, you're dead!" And the startled sound of Wendy's feet hitting the floor over his head, and Wendy's startled, frightened voice, "Jack! Jack!" He stood, blinking down at the shattered radio. Now there was only the snowmobile and the equipment shed to link them to the outside world. He put his hands over his eyes and clutched at his temples. He was getting a headache. And that's the end of chapter 26. Goody. So as you can see, the book is beginning to pick up. I would say a lot of speed, a lot of steam. Really Yeah, I was right about tonight being the night that it kicks into high gear. We're gonna cross over, I think, the halfway point of the book tonight, so that explains it a little bit, I guess. I'm gonna take a quick break, use the bathroom, fill up my water bottle, you know the drill. went to check the table of contents, and for some reason I clicked, oh yeah, stay here, don't remember the page that I wanted to go on. Stay on this page. It's okay though, I'm just gonna have to spam my way back from chapter 24. Now let's click stay here and actually mean it. Okay. So let's talk about what just happened a little bit. Two really important things. That chapter I think was very important. Really, three very important things happened. The first thing was that Jack decided that he was going to write the book. Fuck Al. Fuck Mr. Ullman. Like, he's going to write the book. Then we got a big description of what Jack's childhood was like, what his dad specifically was like, and we got what I consider to be a huge reveal to the point in this story so far, which is when it's revealed to us that Jack's dad would say, take your medicine, come take your medicine, when he was beating Jack or Jack's mom or other members of the family. And that he had a cane which would whack, smack, cut through the air in much the way Danny's visions have described, to the point that the first time I read this, and this is still I think a valid interpretation, if maybe a little iffy, the first time I read through that chapter I actually thought that it was supposed to be a twist reveal that Danny's visions from earlier in the story are not of the Overlook but of his own father's past. And I think that's actually mixed in there for sure, but I don't think it's a complete one or the other. And then of course the third thing that happened was while he was hallucinating the taunting of his dead father, he smashed the CB radio that they would have needed to contact the sheriff's office or emergency services or anything. And now the only way they're going to talk to anyone is with the Snowcat, which is a type of snowmobile, and using it to drive down into the town would be their only chance. So that was a lot. I would say, because I don't want to make any broad sweeping statements about either what abuse is like or what this book says abuse is like until we're a little further in and we've had a little more time for the theme to develop. I'm just gonna let Jack's description of his childhood sort of speak for itself, and I'm gonna let you have it I'm gonna have you interpret it in your own way as to if you have thoughts about where that puts Jack in terms of responsibility for his actions and stuff. I'm going to leave that up to you guys to think about how you feel about that. And once we've gotten further along in the book and sort of seen where Stephen King is going with this theme of abuse, maybe I'll comment on it a little more. Chapter 27, Catatonic. Wendy ran down the hall in her stocking feet and ran down the main stairs in the lobby 2 at a time. She didn't look up at the carpeted flight that led to the second floor, but if she had, she would still have seen Danny standing at the top of them, still and silent, his unfocused eyes directed out of indifferent space, his thumb in his mouth, the collar and shoulders of his shirt damp. There were puffy bruises on his neck and just below his chin. Jack's cries had ceased, but that did nothing to ease her fear. Ripped out of her sleep by his voice, raising in that old hectoring pitch she remembered so well, she still felt she was dreaming, but another part knew she was awake, and that terrified her more. She half expected to burst into the office and find him standing over Danny's sprawled-out body, drunk and confused. She pushed through the door, and Jack was standing there, rubbing his temples with his fingers. His face was ghost white. The two-way CB radio lay at his feet, and a sprinkling of broken glass. "Wendy?" he said uncertainly. "Wendy?" The bewilderment seemed to grow, and for a moment she saw his true face, the one he ordinarily kept so well hidden, and it was a face of desperate unhappiness, the face of an animal caught in a snare beyond its ability to decipher and render harmless. Then the muscles began to work, began to writhe under the skin, the mouth began to tremble infirmly, the Adam's apple began to rise and fall. Her own bewilderment and surprise were overlaid by shock. He was going to cry. She'd seen him cry before, but never since he stopped drinking, and never in those days unless he was very drunk and pathetically remorseful. He was a tight man, drum tight, and his loss of control frightened her all over again. He came toward her, the tears brimming over his lower lids now, his head shaking involuntarily, as if in a fruitless effort to ward off this emotional storm. And his chest drew in a convulsive gasp. Turn the page. That was expelled in a huge, racking sob. His feet, clad in hush puppies, stumbled over the wreck of the radio, and he almost fell into her arms, making her stagger back with his weight. His breath blew into her face, and there was no smell of liquor on it. Of course not. There was no liquor up here. What's wrong? She held him as best as she could. Jack, what is it? But he could do nothing at first but sob, clinging to her, almost crushing the wind from her, his head turning on her shoulder in that helpless, shaking, warding off gesture. His sobs were heavy and fierce. He was shuddering all over, his muscles jerking beneath his plaid shirt and jeans. Jack, what? Tell me what's wrong. At last the sobs began to change themselves into words, most of them incoherent at first, but coming clearer as his tears began to spread themselves. Dream. I guess it was a dream, but it was so real. My mother saying that Daddy was going to be on the radio, and he was telling me to, I don't know, he was yelling at me. So I broke the radio to shut him up. He's dead. I don't even want to dream about him. He's dead. My God, Wendy, my God, I never had a nightmare like that. I never want to have another one. Christ, it was awful. You just fell asleep in the office? No, not here. Downstairs. He was straightening a little now, his weight coming off her, and the steady back and forth motion of his head first slowed and then stopped. I was looking through these old papers, sitting on a chair I set up down there. Milk receipts, dull stuff. I guess I just drowsed off. That's when I started to dream. I must have sleepwalked up here. He essayed a shaky little laugh against her neck. Another first. Where's Danny, Jack? I don't know. Isn't he with you? He wasn't downstairs with you? He looked over his shoulder, and his face tightened at what he saw on her face. Never gonna let me forget that, are you, Wendy? Jack, when I lean over my deathbed, you'll lean over and say... When I'm on my deathbed, you'll lean over and say, serves you right, remember that time you broke Danny's arm? Jack! Jack, what? He asked hotly and jumped to his feet. Are you denying that's what you're thinking? That I heard him? That I heard him once before and I could hurt him again? I want to know where he is, that's all. Go ahead, yell your fucking head off. That'll make everything okay, won't it? She turned and walked out the door. He watched her go, frozen for a moment, a blotter covered with fragments of broken glass in one hand. Then he dropped it into the wastebasket, went after her, and caught her by the lobby desk. He put his hands on her shoulders and turned her around. His face was carefully set. Wendy, I'm sorry. It was the dream. I'm upset. You forgive me? Of course, she said, her face not changing expression. Her wooden shoulders slipped out of his hands. She walked into the middle of the lobby and called, Hey, Doc, where are you? Silence came back. She walked toward the double lobby doors behind one of them and stepped out into the path Jack had shoveled. It was more like a trench. The packed and drifted snow through which the path was cut came to her shoulders. She called him again, her breath coming out in a white plume. When she came back, she had begun to look scared. Controlling his irritation with her, he said reasonably, Are you sure he's not sleeping in his room? I told you he was playing somewhere when I was knitting. I could hear him downstairs. Did you fall asleep? What's that got to do with it? Yes. Danny! Did you look in his room when you came downstairs just now? She stopped. He nodded. I didn't think so. He started up the stairs without waiting for her. She followed him, half running, but he was taking the risers 2 at a time. She almost crashed into his back when he came to a dead stop on the first floor landing. He was rooted there, looking up, his eyes wide. "What?" she began, and followed his gaze. Danny stood there, his eyes blank, sucking his thumb. The marks on his throat were cruelly visible in the light of the hall's electric flambeau. "Danny!" she shrieked. It broke Jack's paralysis, and they rushed up to the stairs together to where he stood. Wendy fell on her knees beside him and swept the boy into her arms. Danny came pliantly enough, but he did not hug her back. It was like hugging a padded stick, and the sweet taste of horror flooded her mouth. He only sucked his thumb and stared with indifferent blankness out into the stairwell beyond both of them. "Danny, what happened?" Jack asked. He put out his hand to touch the puppy side of Danny's neck. "Who did this to—" "Don't you touch him!" Wendy hissed. She clutched Danny in her arms, lifted him, and retreated halfway down the stairs before Jack could do more than stand up, confused. "What? Wendy, what the hell are you—" "Don't you touch him! I'll kill you if you lay your hands on him again!" "Wendy, you bastard!" She turned and ran down the rest of the stairs to the first floor. Danny's head bounced mildly. Is that supposed to say bounced? Bounced mildly up and down as she ran. His thumb was lodged securely in his mouth. His eyes were soaped windows. She turned right at the foot of the stairs, and Jack heard her feet retreat to the end of it. Their bedroom door slammed. The bolt was run home. The lock turned. Brief silence, then the soft, muttered sounds of comforting. He stood for an unknown length of time, literally paralyzed by all that had happened in such a short space of time. His dream was still with him, painting everything in a slightly unreal shade. It was as if he had taken a very mild mescaline hit. Had he maybe hurt Danny, as Wendy thought? Tried to strangle his son at his dead father's request? No, he would never hurt Danny. He fell down the stairs, Doctor. He would never hurt Danny now. How could I know the bub bomb was defective? Never in his life had he been willfully vicious when he was sober, except when he almost killed George Hatfield. "No!" he cried into the darkness. He brought both fists crashing down on his legs, again and again and again. I'm making sure I'm not getting a text like, "Shut up, I'm trying to sleep," but nothing has come. Wendy sat in the overstuffed chair by the window with Danny on her lap, holding him, crooning the old meaningless words, the ones you never remember afterward, no matter how a thing turns out. He had folded into her lap with neither protest nor gladness, like a paper cut out of himself, and his eyes didn't even shift toward the door when Jack had cried out, "No!" somewhere in the hallway. The confusion receded a little bit in her mind, but she now discovered something even worse behind it. Panic. Jack had done this. She had no doubt of it. His denials meant nothing to her. She thought it was perfectly possible that Jack had tried to throttle Danny in his sleep, just as he had smashed the CB radio in his sleep. He was having a breakdown of some kind. But what was she going to do about it? She couldn't stay locked in here forever. They would have to eat. There was really only one question, and it was asked in a mental voice of utter coldness and pragmatism. The voice of her maternity, a cold and passionless voice once it was directed away from the close circle of mother-child and out toward Jack. It was a voice that spoke of self-preservation, only after son preservation, and its question was, exactly how dangerous is he? He had denied doing it. He had been horrified at the bruises, at Danny's soft and implacable disconnection. If he had done it, a separate section of himself had been responsible. The fact that he had done it while he was asleep was, in a terrible, twisted way, encouraging. Wasn't it possible that I forgot to turn down the volume on my thing after I finished my break? Yes. Wasn't it possible that he could be trusted to get them out of here? To get them down and away? And after that? But she could see no further than she and Danny arriving safe at Dr. Edmonds' office in Sidewinder. She had no particular need to see further. The present crisis was more than enough to keep her occupied. She crooned to Danny, rocking him on her breasts. Her fingers on his shoulder had noticed that his t-shirt was damp, but they had not bothered reporting the information to her brain in more than a cursory way. If it had been reported, she might have remembered that Jack's hands, as he hugged her in the office and sobbed against her neck, had been dry. It might have given her pause, but her mind was still on other things. The decision had to be made. To approach Jack or not? Actually, it was not much of a decision. There was nothing she could do alone, not even carry Danny down to the office and call for help on the CB radio. He had suffered a great shock. He ought to be taken out quickly before any permanent damage could be done. She refused to let herself believe that permanent damage might already have been done. And still she agonized over it, looking for another alternative. She did not want to put Danny back within Jack's reach. She was aware now that she had made one bad decision when she had gone against her feelings and Danny's and allowed the snow to close them in for Jack's sake. Another bad decision was when she had shelved the idea of divorce. Now she was nearly paralyzed by the idea that she might be making another mistake, one that she would regret every minute of every day for the rest of her life. There was not a gun in the place. There were knives hanging from the magnetized runners in the kitchen, but Jack was between her and them. In her striving to make the right decision, to find the alternative, the bitter irony of her thoughts did not occur. An hour ago she had been asleep, firmly convinced that things were all right and soon would be even better. Now she was considering the possibility of using a butcher knife on her husband if he tried to interfere with her and her son. At last she stood up with Danny in her arms, her legs trembling. There was no other way. She would have to assume that Jack was awake. No, she would have to assume that Jack, awake, was Jack sane, and that he would help her get Danny down to Sidewinder and Dr. Edwards. And if Jack tried to do anything but help, God help him. She went to the door and unlocked it. Shifting Danny up to her shoulder, she opened it and went out into the hall. Jack, she called nervously and got no answer. With growing trepidation, she walked down to the stairwell, but Jack was not there. And as she stood there on the landing, wondering what to do next, the singing came up from below, rich, angry, bitterly satiric. Let's look this song up. Jack's singing. I don't know this song. Let's look it up. I'll play it for you.
Roll me over, lay me down and do it again. Roll me over in the clover. Roll me over, lay me down and do it again. Well,
This is like a wedding party or something. Roll me over in the clover. Roll me over, lay me down and do it again. She was frightened even more by the sound of him than she had been by his silence, but there was still no alternative. She started down the stairs. Chapter 28. It Was Her. That's the name of this chapter. Jack had stood on the stairs, listening to the crooning, comforting sounds coming muffled through the locked door, and slowly his confusion had given way to anger. Things had never really changed. Not to Wendy. He could be off the juice for 20 years, and still when he came home at night and she embraced him at the door, she would see/sense that little flare. He would see/sense that little flare of her nostrils as she tried to divine scotch or gin fumes, riding the outbound train of his exhalation. She was always going to assume the worst. If he and Danny got in a car accident with a drunken blind man who had had a stroke just before the collision, she would silently blame Danny's injuries on him and turn away. Her face as she had snatched Danny away. It rose up before him, and he suddenly wanted to wipe the anger that had been on it out with his fist. She had no goddamn right. Yes, maybe at first. He had been a lush. He had done terrible things. Breaking Danny's arm had been a terrible thing. But if a man reforms, doesn't he deserve to have his reformation credited sooner or later? And if he doesn't get it, doesn't he deserve the game to go with the name? If a father constantly accuses his virginal daughter of screwing every boy in junior high, must she not at least grow weary enough of it to earn her scoldings? And if a wife secretly, and not so secretly, continues to believe that her teetotaling husband is a drunk, teetotaling husband is a drunk, he got up, walked slowly down to the first floor landing, and stood there for a moment. He took his handkerchief from his back pocket, wiped his lips with it, and considered going down and pounding on the bedroom door, demanding to be let in so he could see his son. She had no right to be so goddamn high-handed. Well, sooner or later she'd have to come out, unless she planned a radical sort of diet for the two of them. A rather ugly grin touched his lips at the thought. Let her come to him. She would in time. He went downstairs to the ground floor, stood aimlessly at the lobby desk for a moment, and then turned right. He went to the dining room and stood just inside the door. The empty tables, their white linen cloths neatly cleaned and pressed beneath their clear plastic covers, glimmered up at him. All was deserted now, but dinner will be served at 8 p.m., unmasking and dancing at midnight. Jack walked among the tables, momentarily forgetting his wife and son upstairs, forgetting the dream, the smashed radio, the bruises. He trailed his fingers over the slick plastic dust covers, trying to imagine how it must have been on that hot August night in 1945. The war won, the future stretching ahead, so various and new, like a land of dreams. The bright and parti-colored Japanese lanterns hung the whole length of the circular drive, the golden yellow light spilling from these high windows that were now drifted over with snow. Men and women in costume. Here a glittering princess, there a high-booted cavalier, flashing jewelry and flashing wit everywhere. Dancing, liquor flowing freely. First wine and then cocktails and then perhaps Boilermakers. The level of conversation going up and up and up until the jolly cry rang out from the bandmaster's podium. The cry of "Unmask! Unmask!" And the Red Death held sway. He found himself standing on the other side of the dining room, just outside the stylized batwing doors of the Colorado Lounge where, on that night in 1945, all the booze would have been free. Belly up to the beer, partner, the drinks are on the house. He stepped through the batwings and into the deep, folded shadows of the bar. And a strange thing occurred. He had been in here before, once to check the inventory sheet Allman had left, and he knew the place had been stripped clean. The shelves were totally bare. But now, lit only murkily by the light which had filtered through from the dining room, which was itself only dimly lit because of the snow blocking the windows, he thought he saw ranks and ranks of bottles twinkling mutedly behind the bar, and siphons and even beer dripping from the spigots of all three highly polished taps. Yes, he could even smell beer, that damp and fermented and yeasty odor, no different from the smell that had hung finely misted around his father's face every night when he came home from work. Eyes widening, he fumbled for the wall switch, and the low, intimate bar lighting came on, circles of 20-watt bulbs implanted on the tops of the 3 wagon wheel chandeliers overhead. The shelves were all empty. They had not even as yet gathered a good coat of dust. The beer taps were dry, as were the chrome drains beneath them. To his left and right, the velvet-upholstered booths stood like men with high backs, each one designed to give a maximum of privacy to the couple inside. Straight ahead, across the red-carpeted floor, 40 bar stools stood around the horseshoe-shaped bar. Each stool was upholstered in leather and embossed with the cattle brands Circle H, Bar D, Bar. That was fitting. Circle H, Bar D, Bar. That was fitting. Rocking W, Lazy B. He approached it, giving his head a little shake of bewilderment as he did so. It was like that day on the playground when... But there was no sense thinking about that. Still, he could have sworn he had seen those bottles. Vaguely, it was true, the way you see darkened shapes of furniture in a room when the curtains have been drawn. Mild glints on glass. The only thing that remained was that smell of beer, and Jack knew that it was the smell that had faded into the woodwork of every bar in the world after a certain period of time, not to be eradicated by any cleaner ever invented. Yet the smell here seemed sharp, almost fresh. He sat down on one of the stools and propped his elbows on the bar's leather-cushioned edge. At his left hand was a bowl for peanuts, now empty, of course. The first bar he'd been in for 19 months and the damn thing was dry. Just his luck. All the same, a bitterly powerful wave of nostalgia swept over him, and the physical craving for a drink seemed to work itself up from his belly to his throat to his mouth and nose, shriveling and wrinkling the tissues as it went, making them cry out for something wet and long and cold. He glanced at the shelves again in wild, irrational hope, but the shelves were just as empty as before. He grinned in pain and frustration. His fists, clenching slowly, made the minute scratchings on the bar's leather-padded edge. "Hi, Lloyd," he said. "A little slow tonight, isn't it?" Lloyd said it was. Lloyd asked him what it would be. "Now, I'm really glad you asked me that," Jack said. "Really glad, because I happen to have 2 20s and 2 10s in my wallet, and I was afraid they'd be sitting there until sometime next April. There isn't a 7-Eleven around here, would you believe it? Thought they had 7-Elevens on the fucking moon." Lloyd sympathized. "So here's what," Jack said. "You set me up to an even 20 martinis, an even 20, just like that, kazang. 1 for every month I've been on the wagon, and 1 to grow on. Can do that, can't you? You aren't too busy?" Lloyd said that he wasn't busy at all. "Good man. You line those Martians up right along the bar, and I'm gonna take them down one by one. White man's burden, Lloyd, my man." Lloyd turned to do the job. Jack reached into his pocket for his money clip and came out with an Excedrin bottle instead. His money clip was on the bedroom bureau, and of course his skinny Shanks wife had locked him out of the bedroom. Nice going, Wendy, you bleeding bitch. I seem to be momentarily light, Jack said. How's my credit in this joint, anyhow? Lloyd said his credit was fine. That's super. I like you, Lloyd. You were always the best of them. Best damn barkeep between Bar and Portland, Maine. Portland, Oregon, for that matter. Lloyd thanked him for saying so. Jack thumped the cap from his Excedrin bottle, shook 2 tablets out, and flipped them into his mouth. The familiar acid-compelling taste flooded in. He had a sudden sensation that people were watching him, curiously and with some contempt. The booths behind him were full. There were graying, distinguished men with beautiful young girls, all of them in costume, watching this sad exercise in the dramatic arts with cold amusement. Jack whirled on his stool, and the booths were all empty. Stretching away from the lounge door to the left and right, the line on his left cornering to flank the bar's horseshoe curved down to the short length of the room. Padded leather seats and backs, gleaming dark formica tables, an ashtray on each one, a book of matches in each ashtray, the words Colorado Lounge stamped in each gold leaf above the Batwing door logo. Stamped on each in gold leaf above the Batwing door logo. He turned back, swallowing the rest of the dissolving Excedrin with a grimace. Lloyd, you're a wonder, he said. Set up already. Your speed is only exceeded by the soulful beauty of your Neapolitan eyes. Salute. Jack contemplated the 20 imaginary drinks, the martini glasses blushing droplets of condensation, each with a swizzle poked through a plump green olive. He could almost smell gin on the air. The wagon, he said. Have you ever been acquainted with a gentleman who was hopped up on the wagon? Lloyd allowed as how he had met such men from time to time. Have you ever renewed acquaintances with such a man after he hopped back off? Lloyd could not, in all honesty, recall. You never did, then, Jack said. He curled his hand around the first drink, carried his fist to his mouth, which was open, turned his fist up. He swallowed and then tossed the imaginary glass over his shoulder. The people were back again, fresh from their costume ball, studying him, laughing behind their hands. He could feel them. If the back bar had featured a mirror instead of those damn stupid empty shelves, he could have seen them. Let them stare. Fuck them. Let anybody stare who wanted to stare. No, you never did, he told Lloyd. Few men ever return from the fabled wagon, but those who do come with a fearful tale to tell. When you jump on, it seems like the brightest, cleanest wagon you ever saw, with 10-foot wheels to keep the bed of it high out of the gutter, where all the drunks are laying around with their brown bags and their Thunderbird and their granddad flashes Popskull bourbon. You're away from all the people who throw you nasty looks and tell you to clean up your act or go put it on in another town. From the gutter, that's the finest luckin' wagon you ever saw, Lloyd, my boy. All hung with bunting and a brass band in front, and 3 majorettes to each side, twirling their batons and flashing their panties at you. Man, you got to get on that wagon, and away from the juicers that are straining canned heat and smelling their own puke to get high again, and poking along the gutter for butts with half an inch left below the filter. He drained 2 more imaginary drinks, and tossed the glasses back over his shoulder. He could almost hear them smashing on the floor. And goddamn if he wasn't starting to feel high. It was the Excedrin. So you climb up, he told Lloyd. And ain't you glad to be there? My God, yes, that's affirmative. That wagon is the biggest and best float in the whole parade, and everybody is lining the streets and clapping and cheering and waving, all for you. Except for those winos passed out in the gutter. Those guys used to be your friends, but that's all behind you now. He carried his empty fist to his mouth and sleuthed down another 4. Sleuthed down another. 4 down, 16 to go, making excellent progress. He swayed a little on the stool. Let him stare if that was how they got off. Take a picture, folks, it'll last longer. Then you start to see things, Lloydie, my boy. Things you missed from the gutter. Like how the floor of the wagon is nothing but a straight pine boards, so fresh they're still bleeding sap, and if you took your shoes off, you'd be sure to get a splinter. Like how the only furniture in the wagon is these long benches with high backs and no cushions to sit on, and in fact they're nothing but pews with a songbook every 5 feet or so. Like how all the people sitting in the pews in the wagon are these flat-chested Albertos in long dresses with a little lace around the collar, and their hair pulled back into buns until it's so tight you can almost hear it screaming. And every vase is flat and pale and shiny. They're all singing, "Shall we Gather at the river, the beautiful, the river. We're gonna pretend that that's how that song goes. And up front there's this reeking bitch with blonde hair playing the organ and telling them to sing louder, sing louder. Somebody slams the songbook into your hands and says, sing it out, brother. If you expect to stay on this wagon, you got to sing morning, noon, and night, especially at night. That's when you realize what the Lagan really is, Lloyd. It's a church with bars on the windows, a church for women and a prison for you. He stopped. Lloyd was gone. Worse still, he'd never been there. The drinks had never been there, only the people in the booths. The people from the costume party, and he could almost hear their muffled laughter as they held their bands to their mouths and pointed, their eyes sparkling with cruel pinpoints of light. He whirled around again. Leave me! Alone? All the booths were empty. The sound of laughter had died like a stir of autumn leaves. Jack stared at the empty lounge for a tick of time, his eyes wide and dark. A pulse beat noticeably in the center of his forehead. In the very center of him a cold certainty was forming, and the certainty was that he was losing his mind. He felt an urge to pick up the bar stool next to him, reverse it, and go back through the place like an avenging whirlwind. Instead he whirled back around to the bar and began to bellow. Roll me over, lay me down, and do it again. Danny's face rose before him. Not Danny's normal face, lively and alert, the eyes sparkling and open, but the catatonic, zombie-like face of a stranger, the eyes dull and opaque, the mouth pursed babyishly around his thumb. What is he doing? Sitting here and talking to himself like a sulky teenager when his son is upstairs someplace, acting like something belonged in a padded room, acting the way Wally Hollis said Vic Stenger had been before the men in the white coats had come to take him away. But I never put a hand on him, goddammit, I didn't! Jack? The voice was timid, hesitant. He was so startled he almost fell off the stool, whirling it around. Wendy was standing just inside the Batwing doors, Danny cradled in her arms like some waxen horror show dummy. The three of them had made a tableau that Jack felt very strongly. It was just before the curtain of Act 2 in some old-time temperance play, one so poorly mounted that the prop man had forgotten to stock the shelves in the den of iniquity. I never touched him, Jack said thickly. I never have since the night I broke his arm, not even to spank him. Jack, that doesn't matter now. What matters is... That matters! He shouted. He brought one fist crashing down on the bar, hard enough to make the empty peanut dishes jump. It matters, goddammit, it matters! Jack, we have to get him off the mountain. Danny began to stir in her arms. The slack, empty expression on his face had begun to break up like a thick mat of ice over some buried surface. His lips twisted, as if at some weird taste. His eyes widened. His hands came up as if to cover them and dropped back. Abruptly, he stiffened in her arms. His back arched into a bow, making Wendy stagger, and he suddenly began to shriek, mad sounds that escaped his straining throat, and bolt after crazy, echoing bolt. The sound seemed to fill the empty downstairs and come back to them like banshees. There might have been 100 Dannys, all screaming at once. Jack! She cried in terror. Oh God, Jack, what's wrong with him? He came off the stool, numb from the waist down, more frightened than he'd ever been in his life. What hole had his son poked through and into? What dark nest, and what had been there to sting him? Danny! He roared. Danny! Danny saw him. He broke his mother's grip with a sudden, fierce strength that gave her no chance to hold him. She stumbled back against one of the booths and nearly fell into it. Daddy! He screamed, running to Jack, his eyes hugs and affrighted. Oh, Daddy, Daddy, it was her! Her! Oh, Daddy! He slammed into Jack's arms like a blunt arrow, making Jack rock on his feet. Danny clutched at him furiously, at first seeming to pummel him like a fighter, then clutching his belt and sobbing against his shirt. Jack could feel his son's face, hot and working against his belly. Daddy, it was her. Jack looked slowly up into Wendy's face. His eyes were like small silver coins. Wendy? Voice soft, nearly purring. Wendy, what did you do to him? Wendy stared back into him in stunned disbelief, her face pallid. She shook her head. Oh, Jack, you must know. Outside it had begun to snow again. That's chapter 28. Whew. Well, damn. So obviously a lot happened in that chapter. Jack's encounter in the bar is a bit strange. It's hard to really pin down what it was. Like in terms of whether Jack's just losing his mind, whether there was ghosts involved, to what degree he is pretending, because he definitely is pretending to some degree. He's just engaging in like some weird thing, He's like sarcastically and frustratedly talking to himself, and he knows that. And he knows that Lloyd is not real, and he knows that the drinks are not real, and he's always aware of that. But he says that he thinks the people behind him laughing at him are real. And when he turns around and he sees nothing, he swears that he's losing his mind. But were they? Is a question that I think he wants us to ask. And that's definitely a theme going forward. The Shining is not like a Blair Witch Project story where it's like, oh, there's there could be just be nothing supernatural happening at all. Like, it's not that type of story, but it's very good at making you question. And up to this point, it's been very good at making us question things. I'm, when I first read that, the last couple chapters we've read, there was definitely a moment where I was like, wait, maybe Jack did hurt him. Maybe there was no lady. But Danny's confirmation of the lady seems to be pretty, like, unambiguous, especially in the way that it's used to create the divide between Jack and Wendy that's now, we're seeing the power in it is reversing in that chapter, as it goes from Wendy being convinced that Jack hurt the son to Jack being convinced that Wendy hurt Doc. We're saying that it's not really at this point used to give any sort of mystery about what happened. It seems to be pretty, in my opinion, it seems to, in that moment, confirm to be pretty obviously supernatural, and sort of an instance of like the hotel's ghosts doing something relatively simple, whatever it was, whether she strangled him or whether she assaulted him or whatever she did, that causes a huge, a comparatively huge rift. It's like the perfect silver bullet pinpoint way to get at the three of them. You know what I mean? I don't know. I guess my thoughts are a little disorganized. We'll have lots to talk about before the start of the next one. We are going to go through to the next chapter. We may stop it there if it's a good length chapter. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit, so I'm considering not going the full 2 hours tonight. But I'm going to take a quick break. We're going to read chapter 29 and maybe talk about it a little bit, and then decide if we're going to go in for chapter 30. I mean, I'm going to decide. You are capable of looking at the length of this video and probably guessing for yourself how many chapters we went on for. Alright, I'll be back in just a minute. So, here's a brief and very silly story. When I was like 10 or 11-ish, maybe a little older than that, probably at least from that time until I was 14, thinking about who I was talking to back then, I watched my fair share of Nick at Night and like the very inoffensive after Nickelodeon sitcoms like Home Improvement and George Lopez and stuff that they would show. And I watched a little bit of Friends, which is not a very funny show, but it is a show with some lovable characters. But it's not funny at all. It's kind of the opposite of Seinfeld, right? Like, I think Seinfeld is funny, but I don't like anyone in it. I would never hang out with them. Anyways, one of the first times it entered my, like, The Shining as a concept entered my mind was in an episode of Friends. They reference it, and of course they don't really, like, Joey says that he has read it, and that the book scares him so much that whenever he's not reading it, he keeps it in his freezer. He's kind of the dumb guy of the group, so it's kind of a joke about how he's dumb. But I remember hearing that, and I'm like, what the fuck? The book is so scary that he's afraid to be in the same room with it? And then as I got a little older, I learned a little more about what horror movies really were, and I had heard The Shining was a horror movie, and you know, that little image stuck with me of like a book that is like fucks you up so bad that like you want to keep it locked away when you're not reading it. And I loved that concept. I was like, could there seriously be something that fucked up, like that could have that much of an impact on me, like, and that I could just read, you know what I mean? And it sort of sat in the back of my mind as the book that Joey stuck in the freezer because he didn't want it to get him. And so I was sort of, when it came time that I got my e-reader and I decided to get really more into reading books off my reading list and knocking stuff off that list, like The Shining came up, you know. The Shining was still to me the book that was locked away in his freezer. And I was really excited to read it based off that. I would say now is when we're getting into the freezer chapters. Is sort of where this was going. I would say that we definitely have started the freezer chapters, and of course there are no freezer chapters because in the episode of Friends, it's made very obvious that the writers only watched the movie and never read the book. Like they make references to all the stuff that's not in the book. Like, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but they're two very different things, and 99% of the cultural references and pop culture stuff that comes from The Shining is not present anywhere in this book. Like, I will say that Here's Johnny is not in the book. But it gained legend status in my mind slowly over the years because of that, and I was very excited to read it. And obviously, as you can tell by the fact that I've gone to the length of suspense, it did not disappoint. It's not a book that I would put in the freezer, only because it would break my e-reader, but it does hurt to read sometimes, and it's hurting more to read now. And that's fun. I'll take one more quick drink here. Let's get through chapter 29 and see what time it is on the other side of that. Chapter 29, Kitchen Talk. Jack carried Danny into the kitchen. The boy was still sobbing wildly, refusing to look up from Jack's chest. In the kitchen, he gave Danny back to Wendy, who still seemed stunned and disbelieving. Jack, I don't know what he's talking about. Please, you must believe that. I do believe it, he said, although he had to admit to himself that it gave him a certain amount of pleasure to see the shoe switch to the other foot, with such dazzling, unexpected speed. But his anger at Wendy had only been a passing gut twitch. In his heart, he knew that Wendy would pour a can of gasoline over herself and strike a match before she would harm Danny. The large tea kettle was on the back burner, poking along on low heat. Jack had dropped a tea bag into his own large ceramic cup and poured hot water halfway. Got cooking sherry, don't you? He asked Wendy. What? Oh, sure, 2 or 3 bottles of it. Oh, sorry, I'm doing the wrong voice. Got cooking sherry, don't you? He asked Wendy. What? Oh, sure, 2 or 3 bottles of it. Which cupboard? She pointed, and Jack took one of the bottles down. He poured a hefty dollop into the teacup, put the sherry back, and filled the last quarter of the cup with milk. Then he added 3 tablespoons of sugar and stirred. He brought it to Danny, whose sobs had tapered off to snifflings and hitchings, but he was trembling all over, and his eyes were wide and starry. Want you to drink this, Doc, Jack said. It's gonna taste freaking awful, but it'll make you feel better. Can you drink it for you, Daddy? Danny nodded and he took the cup. He drank a little, grimaced, and looked questioningly at Jack. Jack nodded and Danny drank again. Wendy felt the familiar twist of jealousy somewhere in her middle, knowing the boy would not have drunk it for her. On the heels of that came an uncomfortable, even startling thought. Had she wanted to think Jack was to blame? Was she that jealous? It was the way her mother would have thought, and that was a really horrible thing. She could remember a Sunday when her dad had taken her to the park. She had toppled from the second tier of the jungle gym, cutting both knees. When her father brought her home, her mother had shrieked at him, "What did you do? Why weren't you watching her? What kind of father are you?" She had hounded him to his grave. By the time he divorced her, it was too late. She'd never even given Jack the benefit of the doubt. Not the smallest. Wendy felt her face burn, yet knew with a kind of helpless finality that if the whole thing were to be played over again, she would do and think the same way. She carried part of her mother with her always, for good and bad. Jack, she began, not sure if she meant to apologize or justify. Either, she knew, would be useless. Not now, he said. It took Danny 15 minutes to drink half the big cup's contents, and by that time he had calmed visibly. The shakes were almost gone. Jack put his hand solemnly on his son's shoulders. Danny, do you think you can tell us exactly what happened to you? It's very important. Danny looked from Jack to Wendy, then back again. In the silent pause, their setting and situation made themselves known. The whoop of the wind outside, driving fresh snow down from the northwest, the creaking and groaning of the old hotel as it settled into another storm. The fact of their disconnect came to Wendy with unexpected force, as it sometimes did, like a blow under the heart. I want to tell you everything, Danny had said. I wish I had before. He picked up the cup and held it, as if comforted by the warmth. Why didn't you, son? Jack brushed Danny's sweaty, tumbled hair back gently from his brow. Because Uncle Al got you the job. I couldn't figure out how it was good for you to stay here and bad for you at the same time. It was... He looked at them for help. He did not have the necessary word. A dilemma? Wendy asked gently. When neither choice seems any good? Yeah, that. He nodded, relieved. Wendy said, The day that you trimmed the hedges, Danny and I had a talk in the truck. The day the first real snow came, remember? Jack nodded. The day he had trimmed the hedges was very clear in his mind. Wendy sighed. I guess we didn't talk enough, did we, Doc? Danny, the picture of woe, shook his head. Exactly what did you talk about? Jack asked. I'm not sure how much I like my wife and son. Discussing how much they love you? Whatever it was, I don't understand it. I feel like I came into a movie just after the intermission. We were discussing you, Wendy said quietly. Maybe we didn't say it all in words, but we both knew. Maybe because I'm your wife, and Danny because he just understands things. Jack was silent. Danny said it just right. The place seemed good for you. You were away from all the pressures that made you so unhappy at Stovington. You were your own boss, working with your hands, so you could save your brain, all your brain, for your evening's writing. Then, I don't know just when, the place began to seem bad for you. Spending all that time down in the cellar, sifting through those old papers, all that old history, talking in your sleep. In my sleep? Jack asked. His face was a curious, startled expression. I talk in my sleep? Most of it is slurry. Once I got up to use the bathroom and you were saying, to hell with it, bring in the slots at least, no one will know, no one will ever know. Another time you woke me right up, practically yelling, unmask, unmask, unmask. Jesus Christ, he said, rubbed a hand over his face. He looked ill. All your drinking habits, too. Chewing Excedrin, wiping your mouth all the time, cranky in the morning. You haven't been able to finish the play yet, have you? No, not yet, but it's only a matter of time. I've been thinking about something else. A new project. The hotel. The project Al Shockley called you about. The one he wanted you to drop. How do you know about that? Jack barked. Were you listening in? You... No, she said. I couldn't have listened in if I wanted to. And you'd know that if you were thinking straight. Danny and I were downstairs that night. The switchboard is shut down. Our phone upstairs is the only one in the hotel that was working because it's patched directly into the outside line. You told me so yourself. And how could you know what Al told me? Danny told me. Danny knew. Same way he sometimes knows when things are misplaced or when people are thinking about divorce. The doctor said... She shook her head impatiently. The doctor was full of shit and we both know it. We've known it for all the time. Remember when Danny said he wanted to see the fire trucks? That was no hunch. He was just a baby. He knows things, and now I'm afraid. She looked at the bruises on Danny's neck. Did you really know Uncle Al had called me, Danny? Danny nodded. He was really mad, Daddy, because you called Mr. Ullman, and Mr. Ullman called him. Uncle Al didn't want you to write anything about the hotel. Jesus, Jack said again. The bruises, Danny. Who tried to strangle you? Danny's face went dark. Her, he said. The woman in that room, in 217. The dead lady. His lips began to tremble again, and he seized the teacup and drank. Jack and Wendy exchanged a scared look over his bowed head. Do you know anything about this? He asked her. She shook her head. Not about this, no. Danny. He raised the boy's frightened face. Try, son. We're right here. I knew it was bad here, Danny said in a low voice, ever since we were in Boulder, because Tony gave me dreams about it. What dreams? I can't remember everything. He showed me the overlook at night with the skull and crossbones on the front. There was pounding. Something, I don't remember what, was chasing after me. A monster. Tony showed me about red rum. What's that, Doc? He shook his head. I don't know. Rum like a yo-ho-ho in a bottle of rum? Jack asked. Danny shook his head again. I don't know. Then we got here and Mr. Halloran talked to me in his car because he has a shine too. Shine? It's... Danny made a sweeping, all-encompassing gesture with his hands. It's being able to understand things, to know things. Sometimes you see things, like me knowing Uncle Al had called, and Mr. Halloran knowing you call me Doc. Mr. Halloran, he was peeling potatoes in the army when he knew his brother got killed in a train crash. And when he called home, it was true. Holy God, Jack whispered. You're not making this up, are you, Dan? Danny shook his head violently. No, I swear to God. Then with a touch of pride he added, Mr. Halloran said I had the best shine of anyone he ever met. We could talk back and forth to each other without hardly opening our mouths. His parents looked at each other again, frankly stunned. Mr. Halloran got me alone because he was worried, Danny went on. He said this was a bad place for people who shine. He said he'd seen things. I saw something too, right after I talked to him when Mr. Ullman was taking us around. What was it? Jack asked. In the presidential suite, on the wall by the door going into the bedroom. A whole lot of blood and some other stuff, gushy stuff. I think that the gushy stuff must have been brains. Oh my God, Jack said. Wendy was very pale now. Her lips were nearly gray. This place, Jack said. Some pretty bad types owned it a while back. Organization people from Las Vegas. Crooks? Danny asked. Yeah, crooks. He looked at Wendy. In 1966, a big-time hood named Vito Gianelli got killed up there, along with his 2 bodyguards. There was a picture in the newspaper. Danny just described the picture. Mr. Halloran said he saw some other stuff, Danny told them. Once about the playground. And once it was something bad in that room. 217. Sorry, one second. I'm gonna cough. A maid saw it and lost her job because she talked about it. So Mr. Halloran went up and he said he saw it too, but he didn't talk about it because he didn't want to lose his job. Except he told me never to go in there. But I did, because I believed him when he said the things you saw there couldn't hurt you. The last was nearly whispered in a low, husky voice, and Danny touched the puff circle of bruises on his neck. What about the playground? Jack asked in a strange, casual voice. I don't know. The playground, he said, and the hedge animals. Jack jumped a little, and Wendy looked at him curiously. Have you seen anything down there, Jack? No, he said. Nothing. Danny was looking at him. Nothing, he said again, more calmly. And that was true. He had been the victim of a hallucination. That was all. Danny, we have to hear about the woman, Wendy said gently. So Danny told him, but his words came in cyclic bursts, sometimes almost verging on incomprehensible garble, in his hurry to spit it out and be free of it. He pushed tighter and tighter against his mother's breast as he talked. I went in, he said. I stole the passkey and I went in. It was like I couldn't help myself. I had to know. And she, the lady, she was in the tub. She was dead, all swelled up. She was, didn't have no clothes on. He looked miserably at his mother, and she started to get up, and she wanted me. I knew she did because I could feel it. She wasn't even thinking. Not in the way you and Daddy think. It was black. It was her think. Like the wasps in that night in my room. Only wanted to hurt, like the wasps. He swallowed like there was silence. He was swallowed and there was silence for a moment. All quiet while the image of the wasps sank into them all. So I ran, Danny said. I ran, but the door was closed. I left it open, but it was closed. I didn't think about just opening it again and running out. I was so scared. So I leaned against the door and closed my eyes and thought of how Mr. Halloran said the things here were just like pictures in a book, and if I... It's like pictures in a book, and if I kept saying to myself, you're not there, go away, you're not there, she would go away. But it didn't work. His voice began to rise hysterically. She grabbed me, turned me around. I could see her eyes, how her eyes were. She started to choke me. I could smell her. I could smell how dead she was. Stop now, shh, Wendy said, alarmed. Stop, Denny, it's all right. She was getting ready to go into her croon again. The Wendy Torrance all-purpose croon, patent pending. Let him finish, Jack said curtly. There isn't any more, Danny said. I passed out, either because she was choking me or just because I was scared. When I came to, I was dreaming you and Mommy were fighting over me, and you wanted to do the bad thing again, Daddy. Then I knew it wasn't a dream at all, and I was awake, and I wet my pants. I wet my pants like a baby. His head fell back against Wendy's sweater, and he began to cry with horrible weakness, his hands lying limp and spent on his lap. Jack got up. Take care of him. What are you gonna do? Her face was full of dread. I'm going up to that room. What did you think I was gonna do? Have coffee? No, don't, Jack, please don't. Wendy, if there's someone else in this hotel, we have to know. Don't you dare leave us alone, she shrieked at him, spittle flew from her lips with the force of her cry. Jack said, Wendy, that's a remarkable imitation of your mom. She burst into tears then, unable to cover her face because Danny was on her lap. I'm sorry, Jack said. But I have to, you know. I'm the goddamn caretaker. It's what I'm paid for. She only cried harder, and he left her that way, going out of the kitchen, rubbing his mouth with his handkerchief as the door swung shut behind him. Don't worry, Mommy, Danny said. He'll be all right. He doesn't shine. Nothing here can hurt him. Through her tears, she said, No, I don't believe that. That's the end of chapter 29. That's where I'm going to cut it off. Chapter 30 is called 217 Revisited. I feel like that is a wonderful place to end off. 217 Revisited is where we will pick up on Thursday live. There's a lot we could talk about there, but I'm a little bit spent, so if you have anything that you would like to say about it, be sure to bring it on Thursday. One hell of a cliffhanger to end up on. That worked out really well. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and get it uploaded. So I'll see you guys on Thursday.